Hello everyone, Gritty here again with another crime novel review. This week I am revisiting the bibliography of George Pelecanos and reviewing the Big Blowdown. So I've already done a pretty thorough description of the author, but I'm just going to go over it a little bit again. George Pelecanos was the writer and producer of shows like The Wire, Treme, and The Deuce, as well as The Pacific. He has received praise from fellow novelists such as Harlan Ellison and Stephen King. He also received praise from Laura Lippman, who at the time was David Simon's wife when they were developing The Wire. So Laura Lippman convinced Simon to take George on as a writer for The Wire, and it was, I believe, his novel The Sweet Forever that convinced David Simon to actually bring him on, first as a writer for The Wire in Season 1, and then as a producer from Season 2 all the way to Season 5. Now, Pelecanos has the distinction of always being the screenwriter who wrote the teleplay for the penultimate, the second-to-last episode of every season. So, Wire fans, if you're out there, if you know, you know. So, let's go right into The Big Blowdown. The Big Blowdown is an epic crime story set mainly in the 1940s of Washington, D.C. It is one part detective novel, one part thriller, and one part western. The novel specifically chronicles the lives of Peter Karras, Joe Recivo, and their two friends, Jimmy Boyle and Billy Nicodemus. So Boyle and Nicodemus take on secondary and tertiary roles respectively through this novel. We are given a brief glimpse into the lives of the four boys in 1930s DC, getting into trouble at school, starting fights with rival gangs of boys, and finding things to do in the Depression-era urban squalor. We're also given a glimpse early on into Karras' service in Japan during World War II, focusing on his psychological dread and desire to survive. In the main story set through 1946 to 1949, both Karras and Recivo have become leg breakers for a local loan shark and extortion artist named Mr. Burke. Burke is an especially cold and unforgiving crime lord, prone to drunkenness and impatient outbursts. His main enforcer is a belligerent goon named Reed with a hair-trigger temper and too much to prove. Burke's main counsel, or consigliere, even though they're not the mafia, is an obese and eerily taciturn dandy named Gearhart. Karras still maintains his humanity and rebellious sense of right and wrong, including letting his fellow immigrants, especially those of Greek descent, slide on their outstanding debts to Mr. Burke. This lax attitude brings him into conflict with his best friend Recivo, who has embraced the gangster lifestyle and wants to prove his loyalty and worth to the boss. The conflict culminates first in Recivo one night stepping aside to let Reed and his thugs break Karras' leg. 3 years later, the men are at odds once again when Karras, now an amateur sleuth of sorts, decides to stand beside diner owner Nick Stefanos when he and his workers are being shaken down by Burke's mob. This is the same mob in which Recivo is now a high-ranking lieutenant. Okay, so my evaluation and a little bit of an analysis. Pelecanos provides another thrilling, sexy, yet harrowing adventure into the DC underworld, not only providing verisimilitude for the criminal world and the law, but also a detailed and visceral tour of the city itself and its residents. So there is descriptions of people who are working on more or less the Manhattan Project, or are aware of the developments of nuclear weapons at the time. There is discussions of the Chinese residents, the Chinatown of DC. It goes into detail of the various sports heroes in the 1930s and 1940s to really give you an idea of who these characters are, what their aspirations are, what their dreams are. And it really has this sense of wonder. It doesn't, not necessarily a gritty novel, although it does go into some dark and macabre places, especially with the serial killer subplot, which I'll get to later. But there's kind of this sense of wonder with regards to it being seen from child's eyes at the beginning, and this idea that the world of DC and America itself is changing and changing rapidly both before and after World War II. It has gorgeously real and readable dialogue, smooth and breezy prose, simple but compelling plot, and moments of moral and even existential meditation. So as I mentioned, there are allusions to the Manhattan Project. There is a female character who describes her own fear of the world just basically being destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. There's very much an idea of Karras owning up to his criminal past and kind of reflecting on how his life has to be hard and how if he could change it over again, he would have taken school more seriously, would have found a safe, stable, working class job, but now has been forced to eke out a life as a sleuth and kind of a grunt worker at a diner, and he is now crippled because of his transgressions against Mr. Burke. By the way, that plot is explicitly mentioned in the Dust Jacket, and it is also described in the prologue. So I don't think I'm taking anything away. I don't think I'm spoiling anything by mentioning that Karras has his leg broken. And really, this story, even though it has a lot of plot twists, it has some mystery, it really is like a lot of, well, really all of Pelecanos' novels, it is at its core a Western. So it's not a whodunit, it's not about figuring, was it Colonel Mustard in the kitchen with the lead pipe or what have you. It's really focused on there being a showdown, really focusing on developing the world and developing the characters. This novel has been described by Pelecanos and others. It's literally on the Dust Jacket here. Let me just find it. Yeah, it's described by Jonathan Lethem, who is the author of Motherless Brooklyn, as a Once Upon a Time in DC. So George Pelecanos is Once Upon a Time in DC. So that's an allusion to the Sergio Leone gangster epic Once Upon a Time in America. I don't disagree. It certainly does show that Pelecanos has really good taste. Sergio Leone, like Pelecanos, was a lover of westerns. His spaghetti westerns are legendary. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Once Upon a Time in the West, Duck You Sucker, which I believe was his last one. There's a similar structure to the Big Blowdown and Once Upon a Time in America. I don't know that Blowdown offers the same reflexivity or the same tapestry as Once Upon a Time in America. But George at this time was still writing his first few novels. This came out in 1996, so literally just 4 years after A Fire and Offense. So I would really like Pelecanos to revisit this world of 1940s, 1930s Washington, D.C., and probably a new cast of characters is called for, but I think there's still a lot of meat on the bone left here in this world that he's clearly very diligently researched on. Now, one thing that I really like about George Pelecanos, and he has admitted in interviews, is that he is kind of a punk rock detective novel writer, or a punk rock crime fiction writer. And what he's kind of indicating is a lack of sophistication in his writing style, or a limitation. He said that the go-go music in DC and the Washington punk rock music, I think most famously Scream, in which Dave Grohl was a drummer, those were inspirations for him to actually go ahead and really try to write something, even though he might not have felt that he had the same kind of education or sophistication as authors who came before him. And that's perfectly fine. You very much see this, especially if you've read other crime novels by other authors in the Big Blowdown. So the structure is kind of a bit clumsy given its chronological order. It seems almost stubbornly chronological. It almost stubbornly linear in the way it's written. So it literally jumps from 1930, let's see here. The prologue is in 1946, and then it jumps to 1933 when Karras and Recivo and Boyle and their other friend, who I always butcher his name, were kids. And then it jumps to World War II, and then it jumps to 1946, and then it jumps to 1949. And I think that the jump from 1946 to 1949 makes sense. I think some of the stuff with World War II and some of the stuff in 1933, I don't have a problem with that, but I can see an author or an editor today say, well, this can be cut. That maybe what would be better is if you told us this information about 1933 and Karras' service in Japan in flashback expositions. So you basically start with the main story starting in 1946, that's fine, jump to 1949, but regarding Karras' experiences when he was a younger man, just mention those in flashbacks at the end of certain chapters as these little vignettes and do it that way. That being said, I really wouldn't make that change. I actually think that the novel is a lot more fun to read because it has this structure. It kind of reads, and this is going to sound like a knock, but I don't mean it as a knock. It kind of reads like fan fiction. I don't want to say, what I meant to say was it kind of reads like online fiction written by an amateur. And again, that's not a knock. So I don't want to say fan fiction because I don't really read fan fiction. It kind of reads like a creepypasta. I'm a big horror fan, so I have read quite a few creepypastas. It kind of reads like that, where there's this lack of these little annoying kind of sophisticated manners of this is how things are done. And that actually makes the novel, to me, seem more fresh. I like that it starts... It technically starts in 1946 with the prologue, but realistically, the actual story starts in 1933 and it carries on all the way until 1950, I think 1956, is it? Which is not exactly part of the main story, but still an interesting part. 1956 or 19... This is going to drive me crazy. 1959. Okay. So I still think it's very endearing. As I mentioned, there's a serial killer subplot in which chubby, fat, or overweight prostitutes, however you want to describe them, are being ritualistically killed. The story might seem a bit tacked on. It does give the character Jimmy Boyle, who is now a low-ranking police officer in the municipal DC force, something to do. And it does tie in together. I could see some people saying that, well, that doesn't really work. Or it seems to take away from the main story. I personally found it very entertaining, especially because we see it from the point of view of the female sex workers. We really feel their dread. We really get a sense of their humanity and their validity. Obviously, people who have criticized Pelecanos for his depiction of women, this probably isn't going to sway them. It's, again, kind of the damsel in distress aspect. I was perfectly entertained, even though a lot of editors would say get rid of that. Certainly they would say that today. I wouldn't change it. I actually really enjoyed it. Another thing that I really wouldn't change is there is a scene with baby Nick Stefanos. Now, some of you might be confused. Why is Nick Stefanos now a diner owner in 1949 Washington, D.C.? This is Nick Stefanos Sr., or the grandpa. The grandpa. I'm trying to use Greek words here. The grandpa Nick Stefanos. In this case, we see the Nick Stefanos of A Fire and Offense and Nick's Trip as an infant in 1959. It's a very short scene. It has realistically nothing to do with the plot. I'm not going to say where it appears because I think that would be too much of a spoiler. I'm not going to say where it appears in the chronology of the story, but even though it is perfectly superfluous, I would not change it. I would absolutely not edit it out because you can really feel the love that Pelecanos has for his characters. You can really feel the love of the family he's depicting, and I really just thought that scene was wonderful. I read it and I must have gotten misty-eyed. I certainly did read it a second time, and it really was just a heartwarming tale, a heartwarming little vignette. And if you're thinking about the plot, if you're thinking about the story, it seems completely unnecessary and irrelevant. I wouldn't change a thing. Okay, so this is a flawed book, but still it is endearingly flawed. It really does work. Again, the chronology. So I'm thinking of Michael Connelly's The Black Echo. So that was his first Harry Bosch book. The descriptions of Harry Bosch's service in Vietnam is told in flashbacks. You don't have like the first chapter where he's in Saigon or he's working through the tunnels underground, fighting against the Viet Cong. It literally starts with Harry Bosch now as a detective trying to investigate a murder, and the descriptions of his service and his trauma related to Vietnam comes to him in flashbacks, and they're told in flashbacks in these little individual vignettes at the end of chapters. And probably a lot of publishers today, if they were to get a book like this, The Big Blowdown, they would say, well, George, you should probably write it the way Michael Connelly wrote The Black Echo. Again, I disagree. I think that the structure is endearing in its kind of lack of sophistication. As an aside, what is with all of these detectives in novels, whether they're meant to be set in the real world or the fictitious world, having the first name of Harry? George is let off the hook for this, as far as I can tell. But I mean, Michael Connelly has Harry Bosch. J.K. Rowling has Harry Potter, which I know that's fantasy and he's a wizard, but still there are mystery elements to the Harry Potter series. Joe Nesbo has Harry Hole, which, good Lord, I don't. That must be because of the language barrier, because I know Joe Nesbo is from Scandinavia. I don't know which language that is. I don't know whether he's Norwegian or Finnish or whatnot, but I mean, Harry Hole, damn. And there's that author who does urban fantasy, the author Jim Butcher, and his main detective or wizard character is Harry Dresden. I really don't know that there are that many people with the name Harry, especially not in North America. I think I've only met a couple Harrys when I was living in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't like I met one every day, you know what I'm saying? But I digress. Very much digress. Anyway, I highly recommend The Big Blowdown. I saw online someone gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so like an 8 out of 10. I'll just say I agree. I have seen some booktubers have recommended getting rid of scores, whether they're, star scores or out of 10 scores. I kind of agree. I don't think that we should necessarily quantify the worth of a book. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend if you've read 1 or 2 George Pelecanos novels and you're not sure if you want to pull the trigger on this one. Definitely pull the trigger on this one. I'm going to say The Big Blowdown, Right as Rain, Hell to Pay definitely, and Soul Circus. These are the books of George's that you buy. You buy them so that you can revisit them because they're worth it. They have that entertainment value. They have that extra something for you to really kind of chew over with regards to subtext. I'm going to say his books, The Cut and The Double, you can just rent from the library. Okay, so please tune in next week, and hopefully I will have a new book review. All right, take care.